Good afternoon. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're delighted to be joined by a friend of the Institute and one of the preeminent analysts of the U.S. Senate, Ira Shapiro. Ira has an interesting background, has an undergraduate degree from Brandeis, a master's in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, has a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania, has had an interesting career of both politics, government, and also trade. He was actually he really is present tense, a top-notch trade lawyer. Worked for the U.S. Trade Ambassador's Office. Was involved in negotiating NAFTA and some other agreements. Has advised some presidential campaigns, particularly on the selection of vice presidential candidates. But one of the reasons we're delighted to talk to him today is that he is, as I said, one of the preeminent analysts of the Senate. He worked in the Senate for about a dozen years and with some really important and high-profile senators, including Jacob Javits, Abraham Ribicoff, Tom Eagleton from Missouri, Robert Byrd, and Jay Rockefeller. He's the author of three terrific books on the U.S. Senate, which populate my bookshelf. The first one is called The Last Great Senate, came out in, I think, 2012. Really important and interesting book. He then followed that up with Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? This came out a few years ago. And he has a new book out that's really gotten attention called Betrayal, How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans, abandoned America. Three really terrific books. I mentioned I was a friend of the Institute. He actually came to visit us a couple years ago. It was in the fall of 2018. Delivered a really terrific Morton Kennedy lecture that got a lot of really high praise from people. Met with a group of students and told them about his career in both trade and politics. We had a wonderful session actually in the conference room here at the Institute. So he made a really positive impression in his visit here, and particularly with the Senate races tightening and the politics of the moment so charged, we could think of no one really better to talk to than our good friend Ira Shapiro. So Ira, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, John, thanks for having me. And frankly, it's a great privilege to be in a conversation with one of my good friends and a journalist and author and public policy person that I admire so much. So this wasn't a heavy lift, John. I mean, the invitation to talk with you and to reach your audience was something wonderful.
Great. Well, thank you, Ira. And I should say, actually, in 2012, Ira and I had books on the Senate that came out around the same time, and we did some book events together and really had a terrific time and enjoyed talking about the Senate. And let's kind of begin there, Ira, because you worked in the Senate for about a dozen years, but what strikes me is just the interesting range of experiences. You worked in a personal staff, committee staff. I think you worked on a special committee. Your senators were in the minority, the majority. They worked on domestic and foreign policies. A really rich, interesting blend of experiences. Tell us how you got pulled in by the Senate, how it came to capture so much of your focus and your interest and your passion.
Well, I'm afraid I will confess to the audience that I haven't made much progress in life. I got out of college graduated in the beginning of June of 1969, came to Washington to do an internship in the Senate, got married 2 weeks later. So I'm still hooked on the Senate, and I'm still married to the same woman, and that was 53 years ago. But I think it's important to say that I was old enough to be in the last constitutional crisis, the Vietnam era, which morphed into Watergate during President Nixon's time in office. And at that time, the Senate was, for many of us, a beacon of hope and good government. It leaned against the imperial presidency of Lyndon Johnson when he escalated the war, and Richard Nixon when he overreached the presidency. And that Senate offered me an opportunity to think about what I might do in public service. But most important, it served the country the way it was supposed to. In stark contrast, I'm afraid, to the Senate that we had during the Trump presidency.
And when you talk about the last great Senate, you talk primarily, I mean, there's no precise definitions, but roughly of the period from 62 to 80. And you write for a period
It's a pretty precise definition, John, because you said it precisely and I made it up precisely.
Okay. But in writing, you say for a period of nearly 20 years, the Senate came closer to the ideal set forth, excuse me, by the founding fathers than at any other time in our nation's history. To just remind people, during this 20 years, I mean, it was in roughly the Great Society Senate that passed, civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid, fair housing, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you think that this sort of the constellation of forces came together to allow for so much productivity? And tell us about one of the pivotal figures in that period, which was Mike Mansfield.
Well, I think, first of all, I called it the last great Senate. It's arguably the only great Senate. Through much of American history, although the Senate was supposed to be the upper house of wise men helping moderate things and get the country through crises, in fact, the Senate was not a success in much of American history. But in the 60s and 70s, a constellation of things came together. The post-World War II greatest generation that came back from the war and went into public service, they had a view of what the nation should be. They believed in its strengths, but they also understood its failings, particularly the discrimination against Black Americans. And they had a view of what the Senate should be and their role to not only represent their party and their states, but to focus on the national interest. And that concept of the Senate was very strong and shared by two parties that, frankly, were closer together, obviously, than they are today. So, and John has asked about Mike Mansfield. Mansfield, the Asia scholar and improbable political leader who came from Montana, I believe was the greatest of the Senate leaders. He served as majority leader for 16 years. And Mansfield's Senate, the one that I got the privilege of working in, Mansfield's Senate was bipartisan to the core and built on mutual trust and respect in a way that we lost a long time ago, but it's been declining even worse over time.
Well, Ira, there's a lot of history to compress, but as I've read your books and I've read them carefully, the Senate has changed, as you say, dramatically in recent years. And you in your writings, you telegraph or you point to a couple events, and I'll compress them quickly. The 78, where you had sort of the rise of political action committees and single issue voting and a whole breed of senators who came in on that. You had the Reagan Revolution of 1980, which brought in a group of very conservative senators. You had the Gingrich Revolution in 94, which a year or two later led to a whole group of new senators. All of this profoundly shaped the Senate. But in your writings, to kind of bring us up to date, in 2007, two leaders emerged, Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader. And you write, under their leadership, the Senate's long decline accelerated precipitously. Their joint legacy would be a broken Senate. Talk about the Reid-McConnell duo, if you will.
Well, I put it that way because for a long time prior to 2007, the Senate had been gradually declining, unable to overcome the centrifugal forces that drove the parties apart. And the parties were genuinely further apart than they had been in the 60s and 70s. But also the media, the 24/7 cable news, the shrill kind of politics, Gingrich's role, which his supporters and opponents would say was large in bringing about the politics of war, politics as war. But prior to McConnell and Reed, leaders at least tried to overcome those differences, particularly Tom Daschle and Trent Lott during Clinton's impeachment trial. They tried, but Reed and McConnell never really tried. They were just faction leaders. And so Democrats were in charge, the Republicans were in charge, but there was no effort to make the Senate work. And the Senate, in Walter Mondale's memorable phrase, the Senate is supposed to be the nation's mediator. That's where the differences get worked out between the parties. But if you don't have that working, those differences aren't getting worked out anywhere. And that's the country we've been living in for quite a while.
Well, let's talk about Senator McConnell, someone that you've written about a lot. And just, I mean, as a brief kind of biographical sketch, obviously it's from Kentucky, was elected to the Senate in 1984, which coincidentally was the same year that Paul Simon was elected to the Senate. McConnell has just been, in 2020, was elected to his 7th term. So he has been there for a long time. Is a smart, shrewd, cagey, tough veteran, kind of made his mark opposing campaign finance reform. So you write about McConnell a lot, but it seems to me that there's sort of two Mitch McConnells. One of them is when there's a Democratic president, and one of them when there's a Republican president. During the presidency of particularly Barack Obama, he was a very, very tough oppositional figure. Arguably, that's continuing with President Biden. Famously said his goal was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. And as you write it in your book, the sort of the kind of paradigmatic moment was in 2009. The country's in deep, deep economic crisis. McConnell had helped President Bush a couple months earlier pass a stimulus plan, but then when President Obama tried to move forward, he aggressively blocked it. Talk about that, and then also more broadly as Mitch McConnell as kind of an opposition leader to Democratic presidents.
Well, I think you're right in saying, John, that there are two McConnells, McConnell as the opposition to Democratic presidents, and then McConnell who works with Republican presidents and indeed was a battering ram for Donald Trump in getting things done like tax cuts and the Supreme Court justices particularly. But really, there's only one McConnell, which is somebody who is there to maximize his power and Republican Party power. I give him credit for great skill, but his skill is in pursuit of partisan goals only, irrespective of what the country might need at any given time. Now, McConnell's defenders, he has a few, he would say, I'm a right of center guy. I don't believe in this socialism that the Democrats are always pushing, which he usually means is helping people with health care or pay for their insurance. But there are conservatives who would be cooperative with Democratic presidents during times of emergency. And I've never been able to get over the fact that McConnell tried to block the economic stimulus in 2009. If he had been successful in the first months of Obama's presidency, we might still be in the Great Recession. And the other thing is, well, there are a lot of other things. I shouldn't, but I'll add one thing. I think we're a fractious, contentious, diverse, big nation. It's not easy to bring people together. Legislating is always going to be difficult. It's supposed to be difficult. But it does require good faith engagement. And my critique of McConnell is that he almost never engages in good faith, basically. And if you put a bad faith player at the center of the political process, you're going to get what we've had. which is hyper-partisanship and much long extended periods of gridlock.
All right, let me read a couple sentences from your book and then have you just elaborate. You say, this is your new book, Betrayal. You say, this is the history of the most catastrophic failure of government in American history. This failure undermined the rule of law and threatened our constitutional rights. It deepened our divisions, pitting red states against blue states, whites against blacks. It endangered our national security, weakening our alliances and strengthening our adversaries. It produced unprecedented economic hardship, throwing millions of hardworking Americans into poverty and despair. It caused many thousands of Americans to die needlessly before their time. It led directly to the insurrection at the Capitol. It was a failure of the United States Senate from January 2017 to February 2021. Elaborate.
Well, look, I'm a Democrat, and I believe that Donald Trump's presidency was a catastrophe for the country with continuing repercussions. We're still living with them. But the failure of government was the Senate's failure. The founders thought that we had a system of checks and balances of which the strong Senate was a central part. And if a president, they wanted a strong president, but they feared one that might be an authoritarian or a monarch. If such a president came along, the Senate was supposed to be the check on that person. And yet 230 years later, when Donald Trump came along, the Senate failed. They failed. Senate Republicans failed repeatedly. They failed knowingly. They failed consciously. And they woke from their torpor only long enough to ram through one more Supreme Court justice a week before the election of 2020. So people say to me, well, the betrayal, that's a pretty harsh term. And I say, yeah, but I think it's accurate. If you take the people that had the principal responsibility, and then they failed consciously and deliberately during a time of utter crisis for our country, I'd say that's a betrayal.
Well, the dimensions that McConnell was most influential during the Trump years, of course, was the Supreme Court and, aggressively and unprecedentedly blocked Barack Obama's appointment almost a year before his term ended. And basically through McConnell, we went from sort of a 5-4 Supreme Court to 6-3, and it seems to have locked in a conservative majority for some years to come. He also was very aggressive in trying to eliminate the Obamacare program without really having a replacement mechanism. Talk about those two dimensions. And I guess with the Supreme Court, it's also the federal courts more broadly, because that was one of his signature achievements from his perspective, which was having the Senate vote almost endlessly on federal court nominees.
Well, McConnell is often very candid or transparent about what he's doing. And McConnell has said numerous times, if you want to influence things for the long term, the courts are what you influence. Elections come and go, majorities change. But if you have the courts, that'll affect things for a long time. And he has pursued that, and he pursued it very effectively. And certainly Democrats, in their hearts of heart, and they've talked about it, I think, don't believe they put enough emphasis on the importance of the court. They got outgunned by McConnell and the Federalist Society over a long period of time. But the effect of without McConnell and his will, Garland would have been on the court. Barrett wouldn't have been on the court. Kavanaugh might not have been on the court. We would have a much different Supreme Court. We will see politically whether what McConnell has, the court he has created, whether that will create so much of a political backlash that the Republicans will live to regret it. But he would say, I think, I'll take that chance. I'd like to have these justices in place and these lower court judges in place. John, the only reason I don't emphasize the lower court judges quite as much is that I found out that Jimmy Carter actually appointed more judges in his term than Trump did in his, which was interesting. But so hundreds get appointed in every presidency. But it's also true that McConnell and Trump got younger judges and more extreme judges through.
Well, in assessing McConnell, you call him the most powerful Senate leader in history. You say McConnell remains a singularly powerful force in American politics and government. No Senate leader has ever combined the length of his tenure and the iron grip of his control on his caucus. And not to really to wordsmith or be too caught up in semantics, I've thought a lot about the notion of him as the most powerful Senate leader. Particularly maybe in the context of who we talked about earlier, Mike Mansfield, who helped bring about kind of a revolution in civil rights and voting rights and Medicare, Medicaid, etc. So when you think of McConnell, I mean, is powerful the right word? I mean, consequential, significant? Kind of parse that word, what you mean by it.
Well, look, I'm a big believer that Mansfield was the greatest leader. But Mansfield was the greatest leader because of the Senate he helped create, in which a lot of people, an ensemble cast, contributed to what the Senate was doing. I believe that McConnell has been more consequential than any individual leader and far more consequential than LBJ when he was in the Senate as Senate leader. But I also believe that McConnell's legacy is a very dark one. I think he's written his page in history, but how it is interpreted, we will be debating over time. And I wrote the book in part to be in that debate. And I think it's important to write these books at this time, period of alternative facts, conspiracy theories, and outright lies. You take your shot at trying to make the case of what the truth was. John, part of what I say in the book, yes, McConnell tried to destroy the Affordable Care Act without any process. Rammed through these Supreme Court justices after blocking Garland. That's large. Also, the number one opponent of climate change policies starting in 2009, the number one opponent of gun control after Sandy Hook. You go down the list and you find all bad roads lead to and from McConnell.
Well, I saw an article recently in the New York Times where Chuck Schumer was, just talking about Democratic accomplishments recently. We'll go back to that in a second. But he was asked about McConnell, and I guess he's talking about more the negative aspects of the McConnell agenda. He said, McConnell brags about the graveyard. I'd like to be proud of achievements, of getting things done, not getting things done. Talk about sort of the negative aspect of the McConnell legacy.
Well, look, McConnell would say, I'm not in favor of all this government action. I mean, yeah, Chuck Schumer wants to get things done. He's a liberal or socialist Democrat. He wouldn't call him a socialist, but he characterizes the Democrats as socialist. I'm not in that camp. I'm a right of center guy. I don't believe in that kind of government action. And he found, which is somewhat obvious when you think about it, but he made it clear, it's a lot easier to obstruct than it is to govern. And Sam Rayburn, once the great House Speaker, once said, any fool, what did he say? Any donkey can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one. It's easy to obstruct, particularly when you've got in the Senate. And McConnell elevated obstruction to an art form. If you thwart, if you make the government unable to work, you will eventually create an anger toward the government that makes things much more difficult. And I believe that you can trace the rise of Trump from Gingrich to McConnell and then to Trump. Our government wasn't in good shape long before Donald Trump came down the golden escalator. So people don't always remember everything that happened before Trump, but it wasn't in good shape even before him. And that was McConnell.
Well, let's talk about the Senate a bit more broadly, because in your book, you cite a really important letter written by 70 former senators, including some real heavyweights, Carl Levin, Sam Nunn, John Warner, Bill Bradley, John Danforth, Tom Daschle, Chris Dodd, in which they write pretty starkly about the modern Senate. They say Congress is not fulfilling its constitutional duties, and much of the responsibility rests on the Senate. And then it goes on to say in this letter, and I want you to play off it, it says, by design, the Senate is the place where Americans with all their competing interests and ideologies are represented, and where champions of those positions attempt to advance their causes and work through their differences. Many call the legislative process sausage making. That's a fair assessment. Legislating is often messy, but it's the American way of holding together a diverse nation. Our concern is that the legislative process is no longer working in the Senate. Talk about that, and also what is the scenario for turning things around? I mean, how does the country get into a better place? How does the Senate get into a better place?
Well, I think that letter from 70 former senators, Democratic and Republican, says it pretty clearly. And certainly Tom Daschle and Trent Lott in one of their books, Crisis Point, said the same thing. It's no secret that the Senate has not worked. The senators they fall all over themselves criticizing the institution they're in. They hate it. And my argument in 3 books has been, well, why don't you change it then? Why don't you take it upon yourselves to make it work? And one of the frustrations for me, John, is that it doesn't take that many people to change it. So this year, surprisingly, we've had several significant bipartisan accomplishments in the Senate. McConnell, I think, decided that the Republicans should not go into the election cycle with a record of utter obstruction. So last year, they supported the infrastructure bill. This year, they supported the CHIPS bill to strengthen the semiconductor industry, and also the first modest gun safety bill in a long time. It's not impossible, but it does require people either to get McConnell's acquiescence or to work around it. And one of the frustrations that powered my book is that it would not have taken very many senators to stop Donald Trump and his assault on our democracy. But after Republicans Jeff Flake and Bob Corker retired, and John McCain died, and Lindsey Graham, the best part of Lindsey Graham, died with John McCain, we didn't have the critical mass to do it. It wouldn't have taken that many people.
Ira, one part of your book that's actually optimistic deals with these ad hoc.
Was there one?
Pardon me?
Was there one? Yes.
There was. No, this kind of flourishing. I mean, flourishing might be too strong. This periodic outbreak of informal coalitions, the so-called gangs, Gang of 12, Gang of 8, to deal on immigration or gun safety or whatever. And I want to read a couple sentences and have you reflect more broadly. You say, reports of their activity conveyed something else, a potentially subversive development. The senators were actually having fun. They enjoyed working together, building relationships based on trust and open communication. They shared the excitement of the highs and lows of the legislative roller coaster ride. They took pride in the importance of the work they were doing, understanding issues, solving problems that arose, making principled compromises. In short, being a real senator in a real Senate. Talk about this group and how it can develop critical mass so it becomes a more pervasive aspect of legislating on Capitol Hill.
Well, having heard that, John, I'm not sure I can say it any better than I did. But I do think I did sense that, just reading what they were saying and how they were going about it. And I think there's a reasonably large number of them that want to be those kind of senators. And that is what motivated them to come together and go through the highs and lows and, the roller coaster ride where one day you think you've got it, the next day it's slipping away, and then you have to rescue it yet again. It's fun to do that kind of thing, particularly when you realize that you're doing it for the American people, and that's what you're supposed to be doing. So I think that's what we've seen in several of the pieces of legislation in the last 2 years. I think that I'd like to think that my book and other criticisms of the Senate would persuade senators to be more like real senators. Like, what are we doing here if we're not doing the work of the American people? And I think some of them get that. Now, interestingly, there's still a large number of them that, are in sort of the hell no school. They don't want to do anything constructive because they believe government, I guess, is bad. If you believe government is really bad, I suppose you could say I'm in it to stop it. I think they should find a different line of work, frankly.
Well, let's talk about where things stand now. And particularly, you made reference to the fact that there were some legislative achievements in the last couple months. You outlined, the climate bill, health bill combination, the veterans bill, the microchip production bill, et cetera. So, on the one hand, there's some things happening that seem to be helping Democrats politically. On the other hand, Senator McConnell seems to be having trouble within his party. He's been pretty clearly critical of some of the Republican candidates who've won primaries. He made a reference in Kentucky a few weeks ago to saying, he didn't know if the 50-50 Senate would go to the Republicans after November. Made a kind of a clear jab at the candidate quality. That got a lot of play. Rick Scott, who chairs the Senate Republican campaign committee, came back, hit McConnell really hard, and he wrote something that I want you to reflect on. This was in the Washington Examiner. So this is Rick Scott, who chairs the Senate Republican Campaign Committee. He says, unfortunately, many of the very people responsible for losing the Senate last cycle are now trying to stop us from winning a majority this time by trash talking our Republican candidates. It's amazing. It's an amazing act of cowardice, and ultimately it's treasonous to the conservative cause. Now, I'm not sure if he was referring to McConnell or whom, but talk about McConnell's political fortunes right now as we're a couple months away from the midterm elections.
Well, if he wasn't talking about McConnell, it's not clear who he was talking about. And certainly, I think he was referencing back to the two races in Georgia that were lost in 2020, which gave the Democrats a majority of the Senate. McConnell would say that Trump was responsible for that because Trump at that time undermined, kept telling people that their votes didn't count for anything, and so the Republicans didn't come out to vote in theory. But look, McConnell is a person with an enormous ego and a justifiable sense that he's really good at politics. So he believes that he understands how to get the majority back. And Rick Scott, from his standpoint, has been a disaster. Rick Scott raised a lot of money and seems to have wasted it trying to build some digital file of all millions of new contributors. Rick Scott also told the world that the Republicans, the Republican platform would be taxing everyone. So everyone in America paid some federal tax, even the low-income people, which they don't now. And that's contrary to the Republican message, which is always no taxes. McConnell also believes that you can't get extreme candidates and win Senate elections. He was very good at controlling the candidates that were picked in 2014, which enabled him to become majority leader. So that's his golden age. The problem with that, I would say, is that the Republican Party has changed. They're more extreme than they ever were. And Trump has not withered away, which was McConnell's fond hope. So you've got Trump endorsing candidates. You've got Rick Scott taking no position in the primaries, and extreme candidates get nominated. That's a McConnell nightmare, but it does reflect the change in the party more than anything else. Now, I'm almost tempted to feel sorry for McConnell, but I don't. McConnell is still raising a fortune through his Senate leadership PAC. I read $100 million. I read $160 million. A Republican operative who's very knowledgeable told me it's closer to $500 million. So the Republicans will have plenty of money. The only good news about our terrible campaign finance system is that both sides will have plenty of money.
Well, if the Republicans were to lose a seat or two, it's now a 50-50 Senate, do you think McConnell's leadership would be imperiled?
I do. I think that Scott does represent something important in the sense that there has been no challenge to McConnell for 16 years. He has what I like to say, he has surfed the madness of the Republican Party. From conservatism to radicalism to nihilism to white nationalism, he's managed to stay afloat. But Scott is plainly not happy with him. And if they lose seats, I think they will have, there will be somebody else that comes forward. Now, the reason McConnell has stayed in power in part because he's very good at what he does, in part because he spreads the money around so effectively, raises it from the donor base, gives it to the senators, they pay off the donor base in legislation, regulatory policy, and judicial appointments. So he's good at all that. But at a certain point, it's hard to keep that mechanism going.
Great. Ira, we have some questions that have been emailed in. Let's go to those. One is from Joy.
Your questions have been so good, John, but I'd like to hear somebody else's.
Okay, well, you'll get some. Joy, from Carbondale, asks you to describe Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans' philosophy of governments. or their metrics of decision making. And let's maybe kind of pony off that to say, is McConnell and the Republic, are they fundamentally different than the Democrats? Does McConnell look at the political chessboard in a way that's fundamentally different than Chuck Schumer? Is he just better at hardball politics than they are?
No, I think I do think there's a genuine difference of philosophy. Democrats being left of center, Republicans being right of center. My criticism of McConnell is that he never steps forward, almost never steps forward to do what the country needs. Our system depends on some degree of minority cooperation. We can argue about how much, but it has to be greater than zero. What McConnell did to the Obama presidency, I think, was unprecedented obstruction. I also think that he shreds norms that are important to our system working. The confirmation process being a good example. When Richard Nixon became president, I'm old, tell the audience, I'm old. When Richard Nixon became president, he was committed to moving the Supreme Court to the right. And he did. But nobody ever questioned the legitimacy of the justices he put in office because they were pretty good justices and because we had a decent confirmation process. It's McConnell who has created this corrupted and embittering confirmation process. So I think it's particularly unfortunate because Senate leaders have a special responsibility to try to bring us together. And he goes the other way. He has not acknowledged that responsibility. He exacerbates differences wherever he can.
Quint from Belleville makes note of the fact that President Obama, in his book, A Promised Land, describes McConnell as being kind of obsessed with the Senate and speaks about the Senate in sort of grandiose terms. It's been a while since I've read Obama's book, so I don't recall exactly what he said. But what McConnell has professed this deep love of the Senate, this deep interest in Senate history. Do you find that? I mean, how do you line that up with some of the norm-breaking behavior you just described?
Well, I think he at one time, I think he is a student of Senate history. If you read some of his speeches, I think they're very good speeches about what the Senate should be. I think he has said Mike Mansfield is the leader that he most admired. And his role model is Henry Clay, the great compromiser. The problem with it is everything he says has been undercut by the way he has behaved. He's the anti-Mansfield in the sense that he destroys trust and mutual confidence. He's certainly not like Henry Clay because he's never a great compromiser. And whatever he thought of the Senate at one point, he traded that in for just basic political power and Republican power.
Bill from Carbondale talks about just the structure of the Senate, saying with 2 seats for every state, and talks about just the disparity or just the fact that very small states have a disproportionate strength in the Senate. And he just wonders if there's anything that practically can be done to make the Senate more functional, more representative.
It's a great question from Bill, and it's on everybody's minds. I would say one thing first. Senate's always been 2 senators from a state, no matter how small. We didn't worry about it too much when senators were real senators. When you looked at the country and small state senators, whether it was Maine or Vermont or Montana, excellent senators, Democratic and Republican. It only became a problem when the parties got further apart and the quality of the senators went down. Now, So that's one thing. Can anything change? The two senators per state is baked in to the Constitution. That can't change. I've thought about whether we might have 10 or 15 nationally elected senators. Enlarge the Senate, get 10 or 15 people who were sort of elected nationwide. But I think that would change things. Certainly, DC and Puerto Rico might have senators. That would change things also. But the real thing for me is to get people there who go back to being real senators, focused on the needs of the country. And they're not supposed to be party hacks. And they're not supposed, if they really care only about their states, they ought to stay in their state capitals. It's honorable work. It's just different job.
Right. I saw an essay this summer from Russ Feingold, who's now the president of a group called the American Constitution Society. And it was an op-ed, I think it was in the Post, where he said, it's time for Democrats to play hardball to thwart Mitch McConnell. And he basically calls on Democrats to just, in the time that they still have control of the Senate, to try to push through as many judges as possible. And he called for suspending or cutting back the August recess, and just basically said, press them through. He said good, solid, qualified judges. And he says, but let's confirm as many as possible. And the quote is, it's certainly what the Republicans would do if they were in power. I guess the question I had as I read this is wondering, are we sort of at a race for the bottom in which this is just, all norms are shattered and it's just, sort of frontal assault. And let me just say, I remember a quote from Bill Russell, the famous basketball player, who once said, choose your enemies carefully because pretty soon you become like them. Are the Democrats in danger of becoming like McConnell?
John, it's the kind of great question that you would ask, I think, because it's actually quite a fundamental question. People are always, for years, people have been saying, why can't the Democrats be tougher? Why do they bring a policy paper to a knife fight? And the answer is actually that if you go, as Michelle Obama once said, when they go low, we go high. Well, you kind of look naive when you do that. But if you go low, it does possibly be a race to the bottom. So what's the answer? One thing I think is when you see somebody doing something that's kind of a legitimate activity, they put a priority on getting judges through when they could. It's not a bad idea for us to do that. I don't think that shreds norms. And Schumer basically did that in the first year. He got a lot of judges through. I wouldn't mind cutting the August recess to get some more things done. But I also think that one of the failings in the Senate has been no effort to update the rules and to reach a consensus on something that might be reasonable. For instance, any president should be able to put his executive branch in place. We've had a very slow appointment process. Reasonable people could come up with a better process than that. And indeed, reasonable people could come up with a better process for confirming judges. But there's been no effort to do so. The answer is you would have to come together and say, this will work no matter who's in the majority, who's in the minority, and we'll put it in place 2 years down the road when we don't know who'll be in the majority. It can be improved, but the race to the bottom is a serious thing to be worried about.
I was looking at some notes the other day, and I'll date myself. I began my time as a congressional reporter in 1991, and I was recalling who was in the Senate at that time.
John, you're a very young person, John.
Well, okay, but so
1991.
But the Senate of that time, I mean, I can't remember all 100 of them, but it included Bob Dole and George Mitchell and Richard Lugar and Pete Domenici and Daniel Moynihan and Paul Simon, I might add, and John Chafee and John Danforth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, everyone sort of laments the good old days, but objectively, there has been an almost remarkable decline in the quality of U.S. senators. And it's also been an institution that is working less effectively. How does that get reversed? I mean, is it just the things you have to do to get elected now in terms of raising money, for 6 straight years, and all that you need to do? Is it just not worth it, and it just doesn't compel good people to run for office?
Oh, I think you'll have good people running for the Senate. People like to be known as senators. That's an impressive title. I guess I think that, the problem is not equally balanced. If you look at the Democratic senators, I think you'll find a lot of senators who could have been as good as the senators of the great Senate. They just had a lousy institution to work in. I think the Republican Party is, in this area, as it is in so many areas, its change has made it the problem. And the Senate will not fundamentally change until this iteration of the Republican Party is defeated. And it has to be, if you were to gain 2 to 4 seats in the Senate, this against the tide, supposedly, in an off-year election, that would be a big change. But the Republican Party has poisoned American politics. And anyone who says that the changes are extreme on both sides, I simply don't believe it's accurate. I don't think John Danforth or Bill Cohen or Al Simpson or any of the old Republicans believe that it's the same, symmetrical. And this iteration of the Republican Party is the problem.
Could a Mike Mansfield be elected now and serve effectively in the Senate?
I think probably he could. But I think Mitt Romney was elected, and I think he could serve effectively in the Senate. I think Lisa Murkowski serves effectively in the Senate, although I don't always agree with her. There's room to still serve effectively. There's just, that's where those gangs sort of come from and work together on. It's just harder than it should be. And because this is an audience who really cares about such things and thinks about such things, I decided some time ago that the principle of Occam's razor, the simplest explanation for a complex phenomenon, is the right one, actually applies to the Senate. McConnell's responsible for everything.
Well, as we wind down, let me ask you this. I mean, you have been the sort of Tolstoy of the Senate. You've written 3 great books, this trilogy, and I know you've said that this.
I'm done.
So what's next for you? I mean, I know you and Nancy love to travel. You've been to Iceland. I mean, tell us about just how else. How else you want to, if there's any other sort of policy area you want to focus on, or is it, what projects do you have on your horizon?
Well, you're nice to ask, John, but I actually don't know yet. Between now and the next 60 days, I'm trying to do what I can to speak or write about the Senate races, because I do think they're very important. After that, I don't know what'll happen. But there won't be a 4th Senate book. Bill Galston, the Brookings scholar, said I had completed an epic trilogy You have to allow for the fact that he's a friend. But trilogy is nice. There won't be a quadrilogy or anything like that. The next book will be entitled, I don't know the subject, but it'll be entitled Without Footnotes, : I've written my last footnote.
Great. Great. Well, tell us a little bit of how you like to relax. As I mentioned, I know you and Nancy went to Iceland. Are you, tell us about some of the things you like to do to unwind.
Well, first of all, I don't whine that much anymore. I mean, to some extent, I had closed my downtown office and stopped most of my consulting in the trade world at the end of 2019. So I basically work from home and have been writing and stuff. I hope I'll be doing more writing. When Trump became elected, I kind of became less interested in international trade and more interested in the threats to the democracy. And so I hope any contribution I can make will sort of be in that area. Relaxing, I never miss at least an hour of television at night while exercising. There's a lot of great content, and we enjoy going back together. We go back over some of the great stuff like Mad Men and Boardwalk Empire. And at night we separate and we watch other things.
It sounds good. Well, Ira, thank you so much for another terrific conversation, and we're going to encourage you to come back to the Midwest sometime soon and return to Carbondale. As I said, you are a gracious.
I'd love to come,
time.
But I'm still waiting for you and Mindy to come to Washington and have dinner with us. So I hope you'll do that.
We look forward to doing that as soon as we possibly can. So, Ira, again, thank you so much. And I would urge everyone who's a political junkie to take a look at Ira's new book, The Betrayal.
Hold up the cover, because the best comment I got, I was interviewed by someone in Minnesota who said, I love that cover. It was so clever to put you and Trump on the cover. Stopped me in my tracks. And I had to sort of say, well, actually, that's Mitch McConnell.
Well, it's funny because my wife actually said, ask Ira who did his cover. She really, really loved it. So
No, that's a good question. But thinking the cover was me, that was not a good question.
Okay, great. Well, again, Ira, thank you so much for your generous time and best of luck. And I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thanks, John. I hope your book is going well.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching another edition of our series. We will have this video on our website soon. Please look at it, share it with family and friends. And thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.